For 24 years, Judge Eleanor Lancaster manipulated justice, ruining countless lives. But today, in her own courtroom, she's about to face something she never expected: the truth. Can one determined lawyer take down the most powerful judge before it's too late? Do you believe justice still exists, even when it's been buried for so long? Share your thoughts in the comments and hit like if you stand for the truth. Now, let's step inside the courtroom, where a high-stakes battle between power and justice is about to unfold. The air inside the grand courtroom was thick, not just with the scent of polished wood and old law books, but with something heavier: fear, hesitation, a silence that felt rehearsed, as if everyone had learned long ago that in Judge Eleanor Lancaster's court, speaking out of turn was a dangerous game. The walls, towering and lined with dark oak, seemed to close in around those who dared enter. The high ceiling, adorned with an old chandelier, cast a dim, golden light over the room, making everything feel heavy. The kind of place where justice was meant to be served, but had instead been twisted, manipulated, and controlled by one woman for far too long. People sat stiffly in the gallery, hands folded, eyes cautious. They weren't just watching a trial. They were watching something they never thought they'd see: a challenge to the woman who had ruled over them with an iron grip. And in the center of it all, at the towering judge's bench, sat Eleanor Lancaster. Lancaster was the kind of judge who never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her mere presence was enough to send chills down a lawyer's spine. With piercing blue eyes that never softened and a sharp, unforgiving mouth, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable. She sat there, her robe draped around her like royal garments, adjusting her glasses with an air of boredom, as if today's case was just another in a long line of trials where the outcome had already been decided. And in her mind, it had been, because it always was. To her, justice was not about truth. It was about control. Her control. And today was supposed to be no different. But across the room, standing tall at the defense table, was someone who had no intention of letting her control this trial: Malcolm Carter. A seasoned attorney, battle-worn but never beaten, Malcolm was known for one thing: taking the cases no one else dared to touch. He had spent decades fighting against a system that was designed to break men like his client, Jerome Willis. And today, he wasn't just here to defend a man falsely accused of armed robbery. He was here to do what no one else had dared to do. He was here to take her down. His dark suit was crisp, his tie perfectly knotted, but his eyes, those told the real story: determined, calculated, ready. He knew exactly what he was up against. He had faced corrupt judges before, but Lancaster, she was on another level. And yet, he didn't flinch. Because Malcolm Carter didn't walk into courtrooms hoping for justice. He walked in demanding it. Next to him sat his client, Jerome Willis, a man who had already been convicted in the eyes of the judge before the trial even began. A black man accused of a crime he didn't commit. That was all it took in Lancaster's courtroom. He sat there, hands folded, staring down at the table, his posture tense with years of knowing that men like him never stood a chance. Malcolm leaned in slightly, voice low but firm. "We're not losing today, Jerome." Jerome barely nodded. Hope was something he had learned not to rely on, because hope had never saved him before. This wasn't just about proving one man's innocence. It wasn't even about exposing one corrupt judge. This was about something much bigger. A system that had allowed Eleanor Lancaster to sit on that bench for 24 years, ruining lives, ignoring evidence, bending the law to fit her own biases. And Malcolm Carter? He was about to shake that system to its core. But Eleanor Lancaster wasn't a woman who went down easily. No, she had spent decades silencing voices like his, and she wasn't about to stop now. The room was silent as the court clerk rose to speak. Case number 22-467. The State of Alabama versus Jerome Willis. Charge: armed robbery. The words echoed through the chamber, formal, sterile, void of the weight they carried for the man sitting at the defense table. Jerome's shoulders tensed. He knew what was coming. He had heard it before. The system didn't need proof, it just needed a name, a face, and in cases like his, a skin color. Across the room, the prosecutor stood up, adjusting his tie with a smirk. Daniel Calloway. Young, ambitious, eager to impress the right people. And today, the right person was sitting high above them, wearing a black robe and an expression of absolute disinterest. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Calloway began, his voice smooth, rehearsed, confident. "This is a simple case. The evidence will show that on the night of April 17th, the defendant, Jerome Willis, entered Carter's liquor store with a firearm. Witnesses will testify to his presence. Surveillance footage places him at the scene. And when police arrived, they found—" "Objection," Malcolm interrupted, standing tall. "Misrepresentation of evidence. There is no clear footage identifying my client, only a blurred figure that could be anyone." A slow sigh came from the bench. Judge Lancaster didn't even look up. "Overruled," she said, flicking a hand dismissively. "Mr. Carter, I suggest you choose your objections wisely. I will not allow theatrics in my courtroom." The words were a warning, a clear message. Sit down. Stay in line. Play by my rules. Malcolm clenched his jaw. He expected this, but that didn't make it any easier to swallow. Calloway continued, barely hiding his smirk. "As I was saying," he went on, detailing a case that had been neatly wrapped up before it even began. Jerome sat still, hands folded in his lap, jaw tight. He had been through this before. The story always sounded the same. The prosecution would paint a picture. A dangerous black man, lurking in the shadows, committing crimes without remorse. They wouldn't say it outright, of course. But they didn't have to, and Lancaster would let them. Every time Malcolm objected, whether it was to an exaggerated claim, a leading question, or a direct violation of court procedure, Lancaster shut him down. Sustained. "Move on, Mr. Carter. I will not allow this trial to be derailed." One by one, Malcolm watched as the rules were bent, twisted, discarded entirely. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Not all of them were blind. A few of them, a middle-aged woman in the front row, an older man in the back, exchanged uncertain glances. They saw what was happening. They saw the way Lancaster cut Malcolm off before he could even finish a sentence, the way Calloway was allowed to speak without interruption. But seeing was not the same as acting. Not in this courtroom. Not in Lancaster's world. For the first time in years, Malcolm felt it, the weight of the walls closing in. He had stepped into this courtroom knowing it would be a battle, but battles had rules, and this wasn't a fight, it was an execution. Lancaster had already decided the verdict. The only thing left was the performance. Malcolm exhaled slowly, steadying himself. This wasn't new. He had faced corrupt judges before. He had seen bias in action, felt the way justice twisted in the wrong hands. But today he wasn't just here to fight for one man. Today he was here to change the game. And if Lancaster thought he was going to sit back and let her railroad Jerome Willis, she was in for a rude awakening. A hush settled over the courtroom, thick like a storm cloud hanging overhead. Judge Eleanor Lancaster sat high above, her face unreadable, her fingers tapping idly against the wooden bench. The prosecution had made its case. The evidence, though flimsy at best, had been presented. And Jerome Willis? He was already halfway to conviction in her eyes, but Malcolm Carter wasn't done. Not even close. Slowly, deliberately, Malcolm rose to his feet. There was no rush in his movements, no panic in his eyes. Instead, there was something else. Certainty. He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of documents. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm, measured, but with an edge that cut through the tension like a blade. "Before we proceed, I'd like to submit into evidence a report, one that sheds light on a pattern of judicial misconduct spanning over 2 decades. The words hit the room like a gunshot. Across the aisle, Prosecutor Daniel Calloway's smirk faltered. Lancaster, for the first time, lifted her gaze fully from the bench, her eyes narrowing. "This," Malcolm continued, holding up the papers, "is a list of past cases tried in this very courtroom. Cases where defendants, primarily black men, were systematically denied fair trials under Judge Lancaster's ruling. Cases where objections were dismissed without cause. Cases where evidence was ignored. Cases that all, coincidentally, ended in the same outcome." He paused, let the silence hang, let the weight of his words sink in. Convictions. The reaction was immediate. Lancaster's gavel slammed down with a force that rattled the room. "Enough!" she barked, her voice cracking like a whip. "Mr. Carter, this is irrelevant to the case at hand. I will not allow baseless accusations to derail my courtroom." Malcolm didn't even blink. "Baseless?" He tilted his head. "Your Honor, these are public records. Every single one of these cases can be verified. Are you saying court transcripts are irrelevant? Her fingers curled around the edge of the bench. The jury shifted again, more of them this time. A few leaned in, interest flickering in their eyes. They weren't sure what they were witnessing, but they knew something was happening. Something big. Lancaster exhaled sharply. I will not entertain conspiracy theories in my courtroom, Mr. Carter. Unless you have a direct, relevant piece of evidence pertaining to this case, I suggest you move on. Malcolm let out a slow breath. And then, he turned. He didn't move toward the defense table. He didn't look at Jerome, or at the jury, or even at Lancaster. He looked toward the back of the courtroom, where the heavy wooden doors stood shut. And then, as if on cue, they opened. The creaking sound echoed through the chamber. Heads turned. Whispers began to rise. A woman stepped inside. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she walked forward, her posture stiff, her face pale but determined. A familiar face to some. A ghost from the past to others. But to Eleanor Lancaster, she was the last person in the world she wanted to see. The room fell silent. The woman reached the witness stand, placing a trembling hand on the rail before turning to face the courtroom. Malcolm met her eyes, offering a small, reassuring nod. State your name for the court. She swallowed hard. Then, her voice, though shaky, rang clear. Sophie Bennett. The name sent a ripple through the gallery. A few people gasped. Others exchanged hushed whispers. Because Sophie Bennett wasn't just anyone. She was Judge Lancaster's former court clerk, and she had vanished 3 years ago. Lancaster's expression darkened. This is highly irregular, she snapped. This witness was not on the list. She has no standing in this case. Actually, Your Honor, Malcolm cut in, Ms. Bennett has direct and critical evidence that pertains not only to this case, but to the integrity of every trial that has passed through this courtroom under your ruling. And then Sophie lifted her hand. Between her fingers, she held a small, black USB drive. The tension in the room became unbearable. Because even before she spoke, before she revealed what was on that drive, everyone felt it. This was it, the moment that could change everything. And for the first time in 24 years, Eleanor Lancaster was not in control. The question now was, how would she fight back? And more importantly, would it be enough? For a moment the courtroom stood still. The air was thick, not just with tension, but with something darker. Fear. Because this wasn't just another day in Judge Eleanor Lancaster's courtroom. No, today, she had been challenged in a way she never expected. And more importantly, in a way she couldn't control. She could feel it slipping through her fingers. The jury shifting uncomfortably, the prosecution's confidence wavering, the audience leaning in. But Lancaster wasn't a woman who lost, and she sure as hell wasn't going to lose to Malcolm Carter. Her face remained unreadable, but her eyes were burning. She straightened in her chair, adjusted her robe as if brushing off the weight of the accusations hanging in the air, and then she spoke. Mr. Carter, her voice rang out, smooth, cold, absolute. I have had enough of your antics. The words slithered through the room like a warning. Your Honor, if I may. Malcolm started, but he never got the chance to finish, because Lancaster's gavel slammed down. The crack of wood against wood sent a shockwave through the room. You may not. And then, in the same breath, she turned to the court officers standing by the door, her tone sharp, clipped, final. Arrest Mr. Carter for obstruction of justice. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even Calloway, the prosecutor, looked stunned. The officers hesitated for half a second, just long enough for everyone to realize they weren't expecting this. No one was. And then, they moved. 2 uniformed men stepped forward, their boots pounding against the marble floor as they advanced toward Malcolm. Hands reached for handcuffs. A murmur of unease spread through the gallery. Jury members exchanged glances, unsure, unsettled. This wasn't how trials were supposed to go. This wasn't justice. But Lancaster sat back in her chair, satisfied. Because this was exactly what she wanted. A distraction. A way to shut Malcolm down before he could go any further. And maybe, just maybe, a way to remind everyone in this courtroom who truly held the power. As the officers approached, Malcolm didn't move. He didn't flinch. Didn't break eye contact with the woman sitting high above him, gripping that gavel like a weapon. For a brief second, the whole world seemed to slow. And in that moment, Malcolm knew exactly what this was. A test. A final desperate attempt by Lancaster to control the narrative. She wanted him out of the way before he could play his final card. But what she didn't know was that he wasn't done yet. Not even close. The tension in the room was suffocating. The officers were closing in, just a few steps away now, their hands hovering over their cuffs, ready to silence Malcolm Carter. Judge Lancaster sat high above, her expression as cold as stone, as if she had already won. But Malcolm? He didn't move. Didn't panic. Didn't even flinch. Instead, he smiled. A slow, knowing smile, one that sent a ripple of uncertainty through the room. And then, in a voice so steady it sliced through the chaos, he said, "I think you should be very careful, Your Honor." Lancaster's fingers tightened around her gavel. "Excuse me?" she hissed. Malcolm didn't break eye contact. He simply reached into his pocket. Slow, deliberate, unshaken. The officers froze. The courtroom held its breath. And then, he pulled out a small silver USB drive. It was tiny, insignificant to anyone who didn't know better. But to Lancaster, it was the most dangerous thing in the room. Malcolm held it up between two fingers, letting it catch the light. "You see," he continued, his voice smooth, unhurried, "this trial was never just about Jerome Willis. No, this trial is about something much bigger." For the first time since the trial began, Lancaster's mask cracked. It was subtle, a twitch of her jaw, a flicker of her eyes. But Malcolm saw it, and he knew she was afraid. "What is that?" she demanded, but the sharpness in her voice wasn't authority anymore. It was fear. Malcolm turned the drive over in his fingers, like a magician about to reveal his final trick. "Oh, this," he mused. "Just a little something I think the jury, no, the entire world, will find very interesting." He took a step forward, voice dropping just slightly, just enough to make sure every word landed exactly where it needed to. "A voice from the past, someone who used to work for you, someone who saw everything." Lancaster's eyes darted toward Sophie Bennett. The color drained from her face. And in that moment, Malcolm knew. She was done. But the game? It was far from over. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. For the first time in her 24-year reign, Judge Eleanor Lancaster wasn't in control. She could feel it. The shift, the unease in the jury, the curiosity in the gallery, the tension crackling in the air like a storm about to break. And at the center of it all, standing tall, unwavering, was Malcolm Carter, holding the USB drive between his fingers like a weapon that was about to detonate. "Your Honor," Malcolm said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Since you've dismissed every objection I've made, perhaps you'd allow me just one final submission?" Lancaster's eyes narrowed. She knew she had to stop him. She knew whatever was on that drive couldn't see the light of day. But she also knew, if she blocked this now, the jury would see it for what it was, a cover-up. And so, through clenched teeth, she forced the words out. "Fine." Malcolm didn't hesitate. With a flick of his wrist, he plugged the USB into the court's audio system. A brief moment of static filled the room. Then, a voice. Her voice. Lancaster's voice. Cold, arrogant, undeniable. "I don't care if they're guilty or not. As long as I get paid, I decide their fate." A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Someone in the gallery muttered, "Oh my God." One of the jurors, a woman who had sat quietly this entire trial, covered her mouth with her hand. Even Daniel Calloway, the young prosecutor who had spent this entire case defending Lancaster's rulings, looked as if the ground beneath him had just given way. And Lancaster, she sat there, frozen. The color drained from her face. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to speak, to explain, to deny, but there was nothing left to say. The recording continued. "You think these idiots will ever figure it out? The jury listens to me. The defense? Irrelevant. I control this courtroom, and as long as I do, no one, not the law, not the press, not some desperate lawyer, can touch me." Silence. The kind that doesn't just fill a room, it drowns it. And then, just barely above a whisper, Jerome Willis, the man who had sat silently through the entire trial, watching as his fate was decided before his eyes, spoke. And there it is. His voice was low, steady, not angry, not even surprised, just tired. The exhaustion of a man who had always known the game was rigged. He had just never thought he'd hear the rules spoken aloud. Lancaster shot up from her chair. "This is outrageous," she snapped. But her voice wavered. For the first time, she wasn't in control. Malcolm watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. "Outrageous?" he repeated. "That's an interesting choice of words, Your Honor." Because to me, he turned to the jury, then to the press, who were now furiously scribbling notes, recording every second of this moment. This sounds more like justice. Lancaster's hands shook. Her entire world was unraveling, and she knew it. But the worst part, she hadn't even reached the bottom yet. Because what came next would be her final fall. The trial is no longer about Jerome Willis. The courtroom is no longer hers to command, and the next sound that fills the room will be the sound of justice catching up to Eleanor Lancaster. The courtroom was no longer the same. Just minutes ago, this place had belonged to Judge Eleanor Lancaster. She had controlled every word spoken, every motion filed, every verdict delivered. But now she was just another defendant waiting for her sentence. The members of the jury sat frozen in their seats. Some gripped the arms of their chairs. Others exchanged uncertain glances. A few leaned forward, eyes locked on the judge's bench, as if trying to process what they had just heard. One woman, who had been furiously taking notes since the trial began, had stopped writing altogether. A man in the front row, a retired teacher, shook his head slowly. His hands were clasped tightly, knuckles white against his skin. They had come into this courtroom believing they were here to judge Jerome Willis. Instead, they had just witnessed the exposure of a far greater crime. And the criminal? The very woman who was supposed to uphold the law. Across the room, Daniel Calloway sat in stunned silence. The prosecutor, so sure of himself at the beginning of this trial, was now staring blankly at the table in front of him. His pen rested motionless against his legal pad. His neatly written notes, once filled with confident strategies, now looked useless, because they were. Calloway had spent this entire trial believing he was on the side of justice, believing he was one of the good guys, believing Lancaster was untouchable. And now he knew the truth. He had been a tool, a pawn in a system rigged from the start. His breath felt shallow. How many cases had he prosecuted under Lancaster's rulings? How many innocent men had been sent to prison because of his blind trust in the system? Slowly, he lifted his gaze, looking toward Lancaster. For the first time since this trial began, he saw her for what she really was. Not a woman of the law, not a protector of justice, but a fraud. And he had been helping her all along. Lancaster's breathing had grown uneven. Her hands, once steady as steel, trembled faintly against the bench. She could feel it, the weight of their stares, the way the walls of her own courtroom were closing in on her. She had commanded respect for 24 years, but respect wasn't what she saw in their eyes now. What she saw was something far worse: disgust, betrayal, and worst of all, recognition. They finally saw her for what she was. The room had changed, the power had shifted, and now every single person inside that courtroom knew one thing for certain: this trial wasn't about Jerome Willis anymore. It was about her. And justice was finally coming for Eleanor Lancaster. The walls are closing in. The courtroom is on the edge of chaos, and the next move, it won't be Lancaster's to make. For a brief, breathless moment, no one moved. The courtroom hung in absolute silence, the kind that didn't just fill the air, it suffocated it. Judge Eleanor Lancaster sat stiffly at the bench, her hands clenched around the gavel as if gripping it tightly enough would somehow restore the power slipping through her fingers. But then, the heavy courtroom doors swung open, and everything changed. A pair of men in dark suits stepped inside, their movements crisp, purposeful. The lead agent, tall, broad-shouldered, with a badge gleaming at his hip, held up a single sheet of paper. Judge Eleanor Lancaster. His voice was steady, official, unshakable. "We have a warrant for your arrest." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The jury, who had just been grappling with the weight of Lancaster's corruption, now sat paralyzed, their eyes darting between the agents and the woman they had just realized was no longer their judge. The gallery erupted into hushed, frantic whispers. And Lancaster? For the first time in 24 years, she had no words. Then, suddenly, "No." The word burst from her lips, sharp, panicked. Lancaster rose from her seat, her chair scraping loudly against the wood. Her once imposing figure now looked small. "I am a sitting judge," she spat, voice laced with disbelief, desperation. "You can't do this." She turned wildly, searching for Calloway, for the court officers, for anyone to stand with her. But the prosecutor, the very man who had once trusted her, simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. The officers, who had always followed her orders without question, stayed rooted in place. And the jury? They simply watched. Not one person moved to help her, because no one was on her side anymore. Lancaster's breath came fast now, her panic rising. "This is a mistake," she hissed, almost pleading now. "I demand a formal hearing." The lead agent cut her off. "You have the right to remain silent," he said firmly, stepping forward. And before Lancaster could react, before she could scramble for one last shred of control, he reached for her wrists and snapped the cuffs into place. The sharp metallic click rang through the courtroom. And just like that, she was no longer the judge. She was no longer the untouchable, unquestioned force that ruled this room. She was just another criminal. The woman who had ordered the imprisonment of hundreds, who had mocked the powerless from behind the safety of her bench, was now the one being led away. The two agents each took an arm, guiding her down the steps. Her feet dragged slightly, as if some part of her still refused to believe this was real. She turned, one last time, toward Malcolm Carter. And in her eyes, beneath the fury, beneath the desperation, was something else. Something she had never felt before. Defeat. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, studying her. Then he simply said, "Looks like justice finally caught up with you." Lancaster opened her mouth. Whether to argue or beg, no one would ever know. Because at that moment, the agents pulled her forward through the same heavy wooden doors she had entered through so many times before. And with one final resounding thud, they slammed shut behind her. For a moment, the courtroom felt frozen in time. The heavy wooden doors had slammed shut behind Judge Eleanor Lancaster, sealing her fate. And yet, the weight of her presence still lingered. Not as a figure of power, but as a warning, a reminder of just how corrupt the system had been under her reign. Then, from the silence, came a voice. "The jury has reached a verdict." All eyes turned to the jury box. The foreman stood, his hands gripping the rail as he cleared his throat. "In the case of the state of Alabama versus Jerome Willis." A pause. The tension coiled in the air, so thick it was suffocating. Jerome's fists tightened against his lap, his breathing shallow. Malcolm stood beside him, steady, unwavering. But even he felt the weight of this moment. "Then, we find the defendant not guilty." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Someone in the back cheered before quickly covering their mouth. Jerome? He didn't move, didn't react, didn't even breathe. Because some part of him, the part that had spent years believing the system would never let him go, refused to believe it was real. "Mr. Willis," the judge called, snapping him back to reality. "You are free to go." And just like that, the shackles around his wrists were unlocked. The metal clinked softly as they fell away, hitting the wooden table with a dull thud. Jerome lifted his hands, staring at them. No chains. For the first time in years, he was truly free. A shaky breath left his lips. Then he turned to Malcolm. "You really did it," he whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. Malcolm placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "No, Jerome," he said. "We did it." The murmurs in the courtroom began to grow louder. Reporters scrambled to capture every last moment, cameras flashing, pens scratching against notebooks. This wasn't just a verdict. This was history. Malcolm took a slow step forward, his eyes sweeping across the room, from the stunned faces of the jury to the tight-lipped prosecutors, still reeling from Lancaster's downfall. Then he looked directly at Calloway. The young prosecutor met his gaze, no longer smug, no longer sure. Just shaken. Malcolm held his stare. "Today, we corrected a mistake." His voice carried through the courtroom, steady and strong. "But let's not pretend this is the first time something like this has happened, and let's not pretend it'll be the last." He let the words settle. Let them sink in. Not just for Calloway, but for everyone. There are more Lancasters out there. A murmur spread through the gallery. And if we don't fight back, if we don't hold them accountable, it will happen again. Silence. A heavy, undeniable truth settled over the room. Malcolm turned back to Jerome, nodding toward the doors. "Come on," he said, his voice softer now. "Let's get you out of here." Together, they walked toward the exit, away from the past toward something new. But just before stepping through those doors, Malcolm paused, turned back, one last time. His voice rang out, quiet but firm. "Justice doesn't just happen. It takes people like you, like me, fighting for it. Every single day." He exhaled, the weight of the case settling into his bones. And this fight, a pause, a small, knowing smile. It's only just beginning, because justice is never given, it's taken back. And today, they took it, together. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it reminded you why justice matters, don't keep it to yourself. Hit the like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure to subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Your support means everything. It's what keeps us going, what fuels our mission to bring these stories to life. Together, we can shine a light on the truth, one story at a time. So stay with us, because the fight for justice is far from over. Subscribe now, and let's keep the conversation going.